Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, my name is Leanne and I'm the lecture coordinator for the Peninsula Seniors. Today we're being rejoined by Peter Small, one of our favorite visitors. Today, Peter Small, a historic impressionist, will be giving us his rendition of FDR.
My friends, I hope you'll pardon me for this unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I have to say, but you have to understand it's a lot easier for me not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs. Many of you may recall about 6 weeks ago when I returned from Yalta in Russia, where I met with Prime Minister Churchill and Premier Stalin to plan our final strategy for the defeat of Nazi Germany. I spoke before a joint session of Congress, and it was the first time that I ever spoke before a joint session of Congress or made a public appearance, not standing at the speaker's dais, but seated in my wheelchair on the floor of the House of Representatives. It was also the first time that I ever spoke about my physical condition. As many of you may know, I was stricken by polio. It was during the summer of 1921. I was vacationing with my family in Campobello, just across the border in New Brunswick in Canada. And I'll never forget that day in August. I was swimming with my children. And when I came out of the water, I felt a chill. And I was bedridden for several days with a deathly high fever. When the fever broke, I found that I'd lost the use of my legs, and it was the doctor's diagnosis that I'd been stricken by infantile paralysis or polio. And when I went through my period of physical rehabilitation during the 1920s, I found out about the therapeutic effects of the waters here in Warm Springs, Georgia, where we are today. And I bought this cottage, where we are presently located, and I also established here the Roosevelt Institute, which is dedicated towards the research and development in trying to find a cure or perhaps a vaccine for this terrible crippler of adults and young children. And many of you may recall during the 1930s, when we founded the March of Dimes to raise funds to fight this terrible crippler of adults and young children. And when I was inaugurated as president in March of 1933, our nation was crippled by the greatest economic catastrophe in our nation's history, the Great Depression. And many people believed and felt that it would hurt national morale to have a crippled man lead a crippled nation. So anytime I appeared in public, it was understood between the press and the Secret Service that I was never to be photographed in a wheelchair, and when I did appear in public, I would have a cane in one hand and be supported by the arm of my son James with the other. Or I would be seated in an open touring car. Or when I met with Mr. Churchill and Mr. Stalin, well, less than 2 months ago at Yalta, and about a year and a half ago at Tehran, when we posed for photographers and the newsreel cameras, we were always seated in chairs. As you can see today, I'm having my portrait painted. It's being done by a Madam Elizabeth Shumatoff. I happen to know her through a mutual friend, a Mrs. Winthrop Rutherford. Some of you, I believe, may know or recognize her by her maiden name, Lucy Mercer Rutherford. Eleanor's not to know about this. You see, Lucy was our social secretary when I was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Wilson administration. And well, Lucy and I fell in love. When Eleanor discovered our affair, she offered me my freedom. She said, "Franklin, if you love her, I will grant you a divorce." But a divorce would have ruined any future political career that I could have had. Why, my own mother even threatened to cut me off from my inheritance. So I agreed with Eleanor that I would never see Lucy again. And I kept that promise until last year when Lucy became widowed, and we privately renewed our friendship. That's all it is. It's nothing romantic or sexual or consummated. Well, of course, it had an effect on our marriage. I don't deny that. True, Eleanor and I were not as intimate as we had been before, but I think in the long run it had a positive effect upon her. It made her more independent-minded, more self-assertive. She began to develop her own political career in parallel to mine, eventually becoming my political partner. After women had gained the right to vote in 1920, she became very active in the women's division of the Democratic Party, openly campaigning and promoting the candidacy of Governor Al Smith of New York. And when I was inaugurated president in March of 1933, she became my eyes and my ears. She became the outspoken advocate on behalf of the unemployed, the disadvantaged, the youth, the students, the minority groups. Why, she's probably been the greatest spokesman on behalf of the rights of American Negroes of probably any public official or public figure since the days of Abraham Lincoln. Well, I'm sure many of you recall back in 1939 when Marian Anderson, the Negro opera singer, was denied the opportunity to sing at the Daughters of the American Revolution's Constitutional Hall because she's colored. My wife resigned from the DAR and saw to it that Miss Anderson sang from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that Easter Sunday of 1939. In the summer of 1941, when American Negroes, under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, were threatening to march upon Washington to protest discrimination and segregation, it was at my wife's insistence that I signed an executive order forbidding any sort of discrimination in hiring in our national defense plants based upon race, creed, color, religion, or national origin. And as a result, the march was called off. And even these past few years, where my major concern has been fighting and winning this war, she has been an outspoken advocate on behalf of the welfare of our Negro servicemen. Again, it was at her insistence that we set up an experimental program over in Tuskegee in Alabama, over at the Tuskegee Institute, for an experimental program to train Negro flyers for the Army Air Corps. Well, I have been told by our Army Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hap Arnold, that this program has been very successful. He has told me about the exploits of the 99th Pursuit Squadron under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. Oh, I'm sure you recall that I had promoted his father, Benjamin Davis, Sr., to be the first Negro general in the United States Army. Well, I have been told that this squadron, led by Colonel Davis, in accompanying and protecting our bombers in their missions over the European theater of war, have not lost a single bomber to enemy fire, a claim that no unit in our Army Air Forces can make. And as I told you, my major concern these past few years has been fighting and winning the war. I see I have some communiques that have been sent to me from the War Department from our Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. And the first one is from General Eisenhower's headquarters in Europe. And General Eisenhower has reported that our forces are advancing deep into Germany, with units of the United States Ninth Army having reached the Elbe River, which put them just 50 miles from Berlin and about 75 to 80 miles from the most advanced units of the Red Army, which are now at the Oder River, which put them just 30 miles from the German capital. It is obvious that the defeat of Germany is imminent, and we can expect a German surrender by this summer or perhaps as early as this spring. In the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur has kept his promise and has returned to the Philippines, invading Luzon, liberating Manila, and recapturing Corregidor. The commander of our Pacific Fleet, Admiral Nimitz, has reported that our Navy has inflicted great losses upon the Japanese fleet. Just last October, off the coast of the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, our Navy delivered a decisive blow against the Japanese fleet. And that our island hopping campaign has met with great success, with our forces securing the island of Iwo Jima, and just 11 days ago, invading the island of Okinawa, bringing us one step closer to the Japanese home islands. B-29 bombers based in the Marianas under the command of General Curtis LeMay are bombing the Japanese home islands daily. The war that Japan brought to our shores more than 3.5 years ago have now been brought back to the Japanese home islands. And while it appears that the war against Germany will be over shortly, I regret to tell you that it appears that the war against Japan will continue on for much longer. I'm afraid into next year, 1946. In discussing our strategy with our combined chiefs of staff, they tell me that such an invasion, which could begin as early as this November with our forces invading the southern home island of Kyushu and our forces invading the main island of Honshu next March of 1946, they tell me that such an invasion could easily result in at least 500,000 American casualties and probably many hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, Japanese casualties, both military and civilian. After all, we have seen how the Japanese have fought to the last man from every island that we have captured from them in the Pacific. And I only wonder what will happen when we begin to invade their main islands later this year and next year. Because as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States and as President in wartime, I am concerned about the health and safety of our more than 12 million men in uniform. And like many American parents, I too have a personal stake and interest in this war. My 4 sons, Franklin Jr., Elliot, James, and John, are serving in all branches of the armed forces on all fronts. And I too wonder and worry what will happen to them if this war continues any longer. Unless, and what I'm about to tell you is never to be repeated beyond this room. Unless our scientists in Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Los Alamos, New Mexico are successful with what they call their Manhattan Project. Now, I'm not a student of science or physics, but according to the project's directors, General Leslie Groves and Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, According to what they have told me, that if one were to take an atom of uranium and split it, it would be like unleashing the power of the sun. And they tell me, in an explosive, it can obliterate a city in an instant. Thank goodness Hitler never got that. Oh yes, we know about the atomic research that they've been developing and conducting in Germany. I mean, they've already developed rockets and jets, fortunately too late to stop our advance into Germany. But I hate to think what would have happened had Hitler had such a weapon. And thank God Albert Einstein wrote me that letter back in 1939, warning me what German scientists were doing. So as a result, we commenced with our Manhattan Project, which, according to General Groves and Dr. Oppenheimer, should be completed by this summer. And if it is successfully tested, we may be able to end this war much sooner and save many hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, I'd like to talk to you about two issues concerning this war and two policies of mine that I know have concerned some of you and have caused some controversy and debate among you, and I'd like to talk about them today. First of all, we have received reports from Nazi-occupied Europe about atrocities committed by the Nazis against millions of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, Russians, and Slavs. Prime Minister Churchill and I have said time and again that those who are responsible for these crimes will be brought to justice at the end of the war. After all, Hitler's anti-Semitism is no hidden secret. He wrote about it in Mein Kampf. And when he came to power in Germany, just a few weeks before I was inaugurated president in early 1933, he immediately began his persecution of the Jewish people throughout Germany. And we began to receive an influx and began to bring in and receive thousands of refugees from Germany, and we brought in as many refugees in from Germany as we could under existing immigration quotas. Let us remember what our situation was during those years. We were in the midst of a Great Depression, and many people wondered, how can we bring in and absorb more refugees into our nation when we can't even find enough work for our own people? And let us remember the degree of isolationism that existed in our nation before we entered the war. Many people believed that Europe's problems were not our problems. And let us also remember the degree of anti-Semitism that has existed in this nation. Why, I was even denounced by some of my most severest critics as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they referred to my New Deal policies as the Jew Deal. Well, let me tell you something. I am proud of what I've done for American Jews. Why, do you know of any single voting bloc in this country? I received the highest rate of support from American Jews in my 4 elections as president, and I'm proud of what I've done for them. In 1939, I nominated Felix Frankfurter, the dean of the Harvard Law School, to become an associate justice of the Supreme Court. And for the past 12 years, my Secretary of the Treasury has been none other than my good friend and neighbor from the Hudson Valley, Henry Morgenthau. You know, Henry just wrote me a letter last year saying that we weren't doing enough to help the refugees. So as a result, we established the War Refugee Board, and we were able to bring over about 1,000 or so refugees from Europe, and we settled them in a camp in upstate New York near the town of Oswego, they will remain for the duration of the war. But these stories and reports we've been hearing from occupied Europe about concentration camps, killing centers, gas chambers is just beyond our imagination. I mean, we had heard similar stories out of Belgium during the First World War about German atrocities which turned out to be exaggerated. I only hope that this is so. And still, I find it hard to believe that even a regime as evil as Hitler's would divert from their own war effort towards the systematic killing of any people is just beyond our imagination. But our policy has been military victory. The sooner that we defeat Nazi Germany, the sooner these atrocities will end. The other topic I'd like to talk to you about has been our relocation of people of Japanese ancestry from our West Coast states of California, Oregon, and Washington. Well, let us remember what our situation was in December of 1941. Our entire Pacific Fleet had been sunk in their berths at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Pacific Air Force destroyed on the ground at Hickman Field on Oahu Island. Our entire West Coast from San Diego in California, north to Seattle, Vancouver in Canada, and even further north to Alaska, was totally open and vulnerable to a Japanese attack. There was fear and panic among many residents of the West Coast. Reports of Japanese planes off the coast of San Francisco. Why, one Jap sub actually attacked us off the coast of Santa Barbara in February of 1942. There was fear and panic among the residents of the West Coast. Fear that there might be spies or saboteurs or fifth columnists among the Japanese American population. And it was urged on me by many public officials, including the then Attorney General of the state of California, and now its distinguished Governor, Earl Warren, that as a precaution we relocate these people into the interior for the duration of the war. So as a result, in February of 1942, I signed Executive Order 9066, which called for the evacuation of all people of Japanese ancestry from our West Coast states of California, Oregon, and Washington. And this order was carried out that spring in cooperation with the Japanese American populations in those three states. Well, I'm very happy and I'm very proud to tell you that we have not had a single act of disloyalty or treason committed by any of these people. They have proven to be loyal American citizens. Why, when their young men were given the opportunity to enlist in the armed forces of the United States, thousands of them did so enthusiastically. I've even been told by our commander in Italy, General Mark Clark, about the, it is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans. He has told me that they have had the highest rate of bravery and valor, as well as the highest rate of casualties of any unit in the United States Army. Well, here it is. Our forces are advancing towards Berlin and Tokyo, advancing towards victory. Our factories are working 24 hours a day to produce the material, the equipment, the supplies, and weapons that we will need. And we will win this war. You know, we've had such a shortage of manpower in our factories these past few years. We've had many women working in our factories. Rosie the Riveter has become a symbol of women working power during these past few years. Now, of course, I think back to more than 12 years ago when I was inaugurated as president, and our nation was crippled by the greatest economic catastrophe in our nation's history, the Great Depression. 1 out of every 4 households was unemployed. Businesses, banks were failing. Houses and farms were being foreclosed. Why, farmers were even spilling their milk, killing their livestock, destroying their crops because they couldn't afford to sell it. People looked to the federal government for hope and relief. When I accepted the nomination of my party as its candidate for president, I said, I pledge to you, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. I said this was more than just a political campaign. This was a call to arms. Give me your votes, not just to win this election, but to restore America to its own people. And when I took the oath of office that March 4th of 1933, I said our greatest primary task was to put people to work. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasonable, unjustified terror that paralyzes needed efforts in order to convert retreat into advance. I called upon the Congress to pass a series of laws to give me the power to fight that depression as if we were being invaded by a foreign foe. The following day, I declared a bank holiday, effectively closing the remaining banks in this nation, preventing more people from making a run on the banks, withdrawing their savings, causing more banks to fail and more people to lose their savings. In the next 100 days, the Congress began to pass a series of laws that would begin to get our nation on the road to recovery. They passed the Glass-Steagall Act, establishing the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, establishing a system of bank insurance to insure bank depositors of their deposits. And as a result of this legislation, we have not had a single bank failure in the United States for the remainder of my administration. We established the Securities and Exchange Commission to oversee and police the stock market, to prevent the type of activity that caused that crash of 1929 and led to that depression. We passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act to provide price supports for farmers so they wouldn't have to spill their milk, kill their livestock, or destroy their crops. We began a program of public works, first under the Civil Works Administration and then under the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, building an infrastructure of streets, roads, bridges, highways, sidewalks, dams, post offices, schools, and libraries throughout the nation. Among these projects have included the Tri-Borough Bridge, connecting the boroughs of Bronx, Queens, and Manhattan in New York City. The Grand Coulee Dam, harnessing the power of the Columbia River and bringing needed hydroelectric power to the northwestern United States. In the southeastern United States, we actually established the first federal public utility, the Tennessee Valley Authority, building a series of dams throughout the Tennessee River Valley, dams creating reservoirs for water storage, flood control, recreation, and generating needed hydroelectric power for the southeastern United States. For the unemployed youth in our cities, we established the Civilian Conservation Corps, bringing out thousands of our unemployed youth to work in our national parks and forests, clearing roads, building recreational facilities, Among these projects have included my Shangri-La in the Kokatkin Mountains of western Maryland, the Skyline Drive through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and the Blue Ridge Parkway through the through the southeastern Appalachian Mountains. For the working man, we passed the Wagner Act, establishing the National Labor Relations Board, giving the working man the right to organize into labor unions and the right of collective bargaining with their employers. And for our older citizens in their later years, we established the Social Security Administration, providing a supplemental source of income for our older citizens in their later years. With these programs, I received the support of the American people in my 4 elections as president. But there has been criticism, well, there's always been criticism, as well as controversy, and yes, there's always been controversy. Some of these Republican leaders have not been content with the tax on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog Fowler. Now, I don't resent the attacks. My wife doesn't resent the attacks, nor do my sons, but Fowler does. You know, he's a Scottie, and when he found out that the Republican fiction writers in Congress had actually concocted a story that I had left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer to pick him up at the cost of, I don't recall, was it 2 or 4 or 8 or $20 million? Why, his Scotch soul was furious, and he has not been the same dog since. But as we began to climb out of this depression, we began to face new challenges and threats from overseas, from dictators such as Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and the warlords of Japan. Even before I was inaugurated as president, Japan had already invaded and annexed Manchuria from China, and by 1937 had launched a full-scale invasion of the Chinese mainland. By 1939, Hitler had rearmed Germany and had occupied Austria and Czechoslovakia without firing a single shot. Mussolini had conquered Ethiopia and Albania, and it appeared that not just Europe, but the world was on the brink of war. And when war broke out in Europe in September of 1939, I addressed the American people, and I understood how they felt. I said that, yes, we would remain neutral, but even a neutral has a right to take account of the facts. Even a neutral has a right to an opinion. And I said then, and I say it again and again, I hate war. I have seen war on air, on land, and on sea, and I hate war. And I say that again and again, because I wanted to see no blackout of peace here in the United States. But by the summer of 1940, France and Western Europe had fallen to the Nazis. Britain stood alone against Hitler's onslaught, and only we in the United States had the resources to help keep up British resistance and resolve. So I made a series of agreements with Prime Minister Churchill. The first was in September of 1940, where we agreed to exchange 50 of our old naval destroyers for British naval bases here in the Western Hemisphere. The following month, in October of 1940, just a few weeks before my unprecedented election to a third term as president, we instituted the first peacetime draft of our young men into the armed forces of the United States. I knew by declaring neutrality it would not protect us against an aggressor nation. And then in late December of 1940, I spoke to the American people and I said that we must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this was an emergency as serious as war itself. I called upon the Congress to pass a series of legislation to help aid the Allies, which we would call Lend-Lease. Now, I remember describing it to a group of reporters, and I said, well, it's as if your neighbor's house was on fire and you lent him a hose to extinguish it, and he would return it to you once the fire had been put out. Well, the Congress passed this act, and we were able to extend billions of dollars of aid to Great Britain and the Allies. Even after the Soviet Union had been attacked by Nazi Germany in June of 1941, we eventually extended Lend-Lease aid to Soviet Russia. But still, I knew we had to get our nation ready. I still find it hard to believe that just 5 months before we were attacked, by only one vote, the House of Representatives voted to extend the draft. I hate to think it would have happened had that not been in place 5 months later. And then I'm sure you can all remember where you were on that Sunday in December of 1941, when we learned that Japanese bombers were attacking our naval and military base in Hawaii. The following day, I went before the United States Congress to express the outrage of the American people by calling Sunday, December 7th, 1941, as a date which would live in infamy, when the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I said that no matter how long it may take for us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I called upon the Congress to declare that a state of war exists between Japan and the United States. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we would gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. Within an hour, we had a declaration of war against Japan. 3 days later, we were at war with Germany and Italy. As I told Winston Churchill, we're all in the same boat now. And yet there has been controversy about my role and behavior, as well as actions, during those critical days in December of 1941. Some of my most severest critics claim that I had had first-hand information and been forewarned about the Japanese attack on Hawaii and deliberately allowed it to happen in order to get our nation into war. Yes, we had broken the Japanese code. Yes, we knew they were going to attack. We didn't know where or when. And, I mean, you have to, and by the time we informed our commanders in Hawaii, they were already under attack. I mean, the very thought that I would ever withhold such vital information from our commanders is totally abominable to me. I mean, the Japanese sunk our fleet in their berths, and they destroyed our planes on the ground. On the ground, damn it. Any American president who would ever deliberately allow that to happen, as far as I'm concerned, should be impeached and removed from office. Well, here it is. Our forces are advancing towards Berlin and Tokyo. We have more than 12 million men under uniform and many more to serve. Our factories working 24 hours a day to produce the material, the equipment, the supplies, and weapons that we will need to win this war. And we will win this war. But we have to build a better world out of this war, one based upon 4 essential freedoms. The first being freedom of speech, for everyone, everywhere in the world. The other being freedom of religion, the right of everyone to worship God in their own way, for everyone, everywhere in the world. Third being freedom from fear, so that every nation would live securely within its own boundaries and not worry about an attack by an aggressor nation or by its neighbor. For every nation, everywhere in the world. And finally, freedom from want, so that no nation would be without the resources that it would need in order to maintain their national existence, for every nation, everywhere in the world. This is not some vision of some distant millennium, but something that we can achieve here in our lifetime. And that's why I'm very anxious about the upcoming conference in San Francisco, which we're going to hold in about 2 weeks' time to help organize the United Nations organization. And I regret that we did not listen to the advice of President Wilson and join the League of Nations, because if we had and had taken an active role, we might have been able to prevent a second world war. And I am afraid that any other future such conflict can and will destroy civilization as we now know it. Now, tomorrow is Friday, April 13th. It is also the 202nd anniversary of the birth of Thomas Jefferson. And I will be speaking at a Jefferson Day dinner where I will be introduced by Vice President Truman. Well, you recall that Harry just became my vice president last January, replacing Vice President Henry Wallace, who is now our Secretary of Commerce. I'm sure you recall Harry. He was the senator from Missouri for the past 10 years, and he was the chairman of that committee, the Truman Committee, which investigated waste in spending in our defense plants and military bases, and I understand did a very effective job by saving the taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. Why, last year when they took a poll of reporters in Washington, D.C., and they asked who had done the most to contribute to the war effort in our nation's capital, Senator Truman's committee came in second, right behind Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. Well, as you know, last year, 1944, was an election year. And, of course, the Democratic Party would renominate me to run for a fourth term as president. But there were many Democrats, especially Southern Democrats, who were not very enthusiastic about renominating Vice President Henry Wallace. So they were looking for a candidate who would be acceptable not just to Southern Democrats, but to Northern Democrats and labor leaders. And so the name of Senator Truman was suggested. Well, as you know, Harry and I were nominated last year, and of course we were elected in November, and we were sworn in this past January. Excuse me. I have a terrific headache. You'll have to forgive me, but I'm going to have to retire this afternoon after I'm finished speaking with you. But before I do, I would like to share with you some words that I am going to say tomorrow, and I think they best express my view for building a better and more peaceful post-war world. Today, we are faced with the preeminent fact that if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the abilities of all peoples of all kinds to live together and work together in the same world at peace. I move more firmly into the task knowing that you are joined with me in the resolve to make this work endure. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith. Thank you all very much. And now, my friends, If you have any questions for me about my life or my times or my presidency, please do not hesitate to ask. After all, I've just about exposed my life to you more than any public official should or would. Yes, in the back. Ah, yes, you were asking about the SS St. Louis. He was asking about the SS St. Louis, which was a ship full of German Jewish refugees that left Hamburg in 1939, and why we didn't allow them to enter. Well, they did have visas to enter Cuba. Unfortunately, the Cuban government did not honor those visas. And since they did not have visas to enter the United States, we could not grant them permission to land. However, I understood that Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands granted asylum to those refugees. Now, as far as what happened to those refugees who settled in the nations occupied by the Nazis, we do not know their fate. Yes, sir. He wants to know when they changed the inauguration from March to January. As you know, I was inaugurated on March 4th. Right before my inauguration, the 20th Amendment was ratified, which changed the inauguration day from March 4th to January 20th. So while it did not affect my first inauguration, my other inaugurations were moved to January 20th. Yes, over there. Oh, you're one of our flyboys, yes? Well, thank you very much for your service. Yes, he asked if I gave a lot of credit to what I called the flyboys, which was originally the Army Air Corps and developed into the Army Air Forces. Yes, we knew that air power was going to be the decisive weapon and tactic in winning this war, and it has been. After all, it was very decisive to the success of the German Blitzkrieg, and it has been very instrumental to our victory over Japan and Germany. Yes, sir. Was the letter from Einstein the crucial element in going ahead with the atomic bomb? Well, it was more than just the fact that it was from Albert Einstein, who obviously was, who came here as a refugee from Germany early when Hitler came to power. It was not just the fact that it was from someone as prominent as from Albert Einstein, but the fact that the Germans were already involved with atomic research, and we knew what would happen if they developed such a weapon. So it was very important for us to develop such a weapon before the Germans did. Yes. Which is why didn't we move the fleet out of Hawaii?
To San Diego.
To San Diego? Well, the idea was to send our fleet from San Diego to Hawaii to send a message to the Japanese that we were ready to meet them and hopefully to deter them. We didn't expect the entire fleet to be destroyed, to be mostly sunk in one day in Hawaii. And plus, many of us felt that the fact that Hawaii was such a long distance from Japan, that it would be more likely for the Japanese to attack perhaps the Philippines first, then before they even came near Hawaii. Oh, yes, in the back. A memorial to me? Well, I'm very touched. But I believe if it's a memorial, I believe I would have to die first. But I did have the honor and the privilege of course, dedicating the Jefferson Memorial just 2 years ago. What is my impression of Stalin? Well, of course, I know Winston Churchill doesn't trust him very much. He said when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, if Hitler had invaded hell, he would speak positively of the devil in the House of Commons. And he believes that we should meet the Red Army as far east as possible. But without Stalin, we would not have been able to defeat Nazi Germany, and his help has been invaluable. And I believe that after meeting him a couple of times, I believe we can work together in building a better, more peaceful post-war Europe. She wanted to know about my headache. Was it a precursor to my health? Well, as I said, my doctor publicly has said I have a clean bill of health, Dr. Grayson, and although don't tell anyone, I actually did have congestive heart failure last year, but we want to keep that from the public. The only reason I ran for a fourth term was because, well, the war was going on and we have to win this war. Well, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you all very much for coming to Warm Springs today.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.